American murderer Stephen LaWayne Nelson, born February 18, 1987, is incarcerated on death row for the 2011 killing of Clinton Dobson, a 28-year-old pastor from Arlington, Texas. Nelson was sentenced to death on October 16, 2012, after being found guilty of killing Dobson by suffocating him to death during a robbery attempt at a church in Arlington on March 3, 2011. Nelson, who was also accused of killing a fellow prisoner while incarcerated, denied any involvement in the murder of Clint Dobson and maintained that he was merely a lookout. He also identified two of his pals as Dobson's true killers and said that his trial attorney had not adequately refuted their alibis. Nelson's conviction and imprisonment were affirmed after his grounds for appeal were denied. His execution date is set for February 5, 2025, because he has exhausted all of his appeals. On February 18, 1987, Stephen LaWayne Nelson was born in Oklahoma, USA. Nelson was abused and neglected as a child and had a brother and a sister who was deaf. While Nelson's father was frequently away from his childhood and violent towards his wife and children, Nelson's mother never paid much attention to her children and occasionally left him alone at home for 3 or 4 days. Nelson attended school through the 11th grade. When Nelson was 3 years old, he went to burn his mother's bed in the living room in order to hurt himself. When he was 6 years old, he committed property offenses, burglaries, thefts, and serious assault, which led to multiple encounters with Oklahoma's juvenile authorities. He was placed in a high-risk juvenile prison facility at an early age because of his ongoing involvement in offenses, despite efforts by authorities to intervene through counseling and probation. Nelson relocated to Tarrant County, Texas with his family. He was tried in Texas juvenile courts nonetheless, since he kept committing crimes. In a rare instance for property offenses at his age, Nelson was arrested at the age of 14 for burglary, criminal trespassing, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. The juvenile court in Tarrant County sentenced him to an indeterminate time in a juvenile jail. Nelson spent more than 3.5 years at the Texas Youth Commission after being first sentenced to 9 months there for persistent violations, which included 4 high-level disciplinary hearings. Nelson was under the juvenile system's spotlight when he was 20 years old and had been freed on parole twice, but he frequently broke his terms. He was arrested for using a stolen vehicle in 2005 when he was 18 years old. He pretended to be a Walmart employee and stole a laptop from the store in November 2007 by concealing it in his jeans. He was also caught stealing boots by wearing them out of the store without paying at another Walmart in Arlington the next week. Nelson was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon after his then live-in girlfriend filed a complaint against him because he beat her following his release from state prison in 2010. Due to his lengthy past, the DA rejected his girlfriend's non-prosecution affidavit to drop the charges 3 days later. After that, he was put on probation and taken to the Intermediate Sanctions Facility for a 90-day program. On March 3, 2011, Nelson, who was still on probation for assaulting his ex-girlfriend, stormed into the North Point Baptist Church. The people there were Judy Elliott, a 69-year-old church secretary, and Clinton Dobson, a 28-year-old preacher. Stephen attacked Dobson and Elliott in order to rob them. After being beaten, Dobson was strangled with a computer extension cord and then covered with a garbage bag. Elliott was badly assaulted, suffering catastrophic injuries to her face, head, arms, legs, and back, in addition to internal bleeding in her brain. Despite this, she survived. Nelson took Elliott's credit cards, Dobson's laptop, a cell phone, and Elliott's vehicle after leaving Elliott for dead. Nelson then sold the laptop for the money and used the credit cards to buy new jewelry and clothes. Laura Dobson called the church's part-time music pastor, Jake Turner, since she couldn't get through to her husband on the phone. Turner called John, the husband of Judy Elliott, who promptly drove to the church after Turner also said he would be going there. When John first arrived, he entered the church using his passcode. Once inside, he saw Dobson's office in a state of disorder, and the lady, who he didn't instantly recognize as his wife, laying on the floor, badly beaten. John, however, failed to notice Dobson slumped near the desk. John called the police right away, and when they got there, Arlington policeman Jesse Parrish found Dobson's body. Elliot was taken to the hospital, while Dobson was declared dead at the scene. Elliot survived her injuries in spite of the doctor's dire predictions and a heart attack while she was in the hospital. She needed therapy and rehabilitation for 5 months after she was discharged from the hospital 2 weeks later. Elliot's face was permanently supported using a mix of metal parts, screws, and a mesh. Elliot was able to testify seeing multiple people that day. Dr. Nizam Parwani, a Tarrant County medical examiner, later performed an autopsy. The findings indicated that Dobson's injuries were most likely the result of a violent struggle in which he attempted to defend himself from strikes that might have been given by a firearm butt. It looked like the office computer monitor stand was responsible for 2 of the cuts on his forehead. The injuries showed that Dobson was probably standing when he was first struck in the head, and then he was struck in the back of his head as he fell. Dobson was strangled to death when the plastic bag covering his face suffocated him. Nelson was ultimately connected to the crime after police investigations deemed the Dobson death case to be one of murder. A warrant of arrest was issued in Nelson's case, and police were able to seize him after he failed to report to his probation officer on the day of the murder. The police discovered that Nelson was in possession of both Elliot's and Dobson's things. Nelson's shoes had bloodstains on them, and forensic analysis revealed that the stain's DNA belonged to both Dobson and Elliot. Nelson's fingerprints were also found to match those taken from the crime site. He was accused with capital murder after his arrest. According to Texas state law, this offense entails a life sentence without the possibility of parole or the death penalty. Another man, 19-year-old Anthony Gregory Springs, was also taken into custody and accused of murder. However, Springs was later freed after the prosecution dropped the accusation. Stephen Nelson was detained in a Tarrant County jail following his indictment, pending trial for the murder of Clint Dobson. He had often broken the rules and behaved violently and disruptively while he was on remand. He damaged prison property, threatened an officer, and broke a telephone in the visitation booth, among other major offenses. Additionally, he frequently engaged in violent altercations with correctional officers, including one instance in which 3 guards had to restrain him in order to stop him. The most significant event, though, happened on March 19, 2012, when Nelson is accused of killing a mentally ill inmate. Sources claim that on that particular day, Jonathan Holden, a prisoner serving a sentence for stealing, allegedly murmured a racist epithet that was disparaging to African Americans, which infuriated some of the other inmates, particularly those of African American heritage. Nelson was likely equally angry, even though he and Holden were held separately and did not share a cell. Holden was lured to the bars of his cell by Nelson, who then held up a blanket-made noose. In order to gain a transfer to a different area of the jail, Nelson instructed Holden to stage a suicide by hanging himself. Nelson tightened the blanket by pressing his feet against the bars, pushing on the blanket with both hands, and forcing Holden against the wall and nearly off his feet when Holden complied to advancing to the cell bars and having the noose looped around his neck. After killing Holden, Nelson started to dance and even played a broom like a guitar, according to the other inmates. Holden passed away 4 minutes later. Allegedly, Nelson did call security to help Holden, but these details were never confirmed. After Holden's death came to light, Nelson was moved to a different cell in the same hallway where they were already in solitary confinement and kept apart from the rest of the jail population because of his suspected role in Holden's murder. Nevertheless, despite being segregated from the other prisoners, Nelson persisted in misbehaving. The family of Holden filed a civil rights complaint against Tarrant County in 2014, 2 years after Holden's death. In the end, the family reached a settlement and received $350,000. Stephen Nelson was put on trial for Clint Dobson's murder on October 1, 2012. A Tarrant County jury indicted Nelson on 1 count of capital murder and another count of attempted capital murder. The prosecution stated that Nelson would be subject to the death penalty. They contended during the trial that Nelson was the only one responsible for Dobson's death. They maintained that Nelson was actually there at the crime site because of the forensic evidence. They pointed to proof that he had sold Dobson's laptop, stolen the victim's possessions, and made purchases using the victim's credit cards. The prosecution urged the jury to convict Nelson based on circumstantial evidence that strongly implicated him as the murderer, describing him as a predator who committed a horrible crime. As part of his defense, Nelson stated that he was not the only person involved in the murder and named two of his friends, Claude Jefferson and Anthony Springs, as Dobson's killers. He said that after entering the church with Springs and Jefferson, he took Dobson's laptop, Elliot's keys, and Elliot's credit cards and fled. He went on to say that while he was outside serving as a lookout, Jefferson and Springs were both with the victims, attacking them. He denied attacking Elliot or killing Dobson, saying he was only responsible for robbing the victims. But for the time of the murder, Jefferson and Springs both had alibis. Jefferson claimed he was at his university for a chemistry test, but this was never verified because Nelson's attorney questioned the professor and he said there was no chemistry test that day. Springs's phone was more than 30 miles away from the murder scene, but it's important to note that Springs had multiple cell phones and SIM cards. Nelson claimed that he slid under a table to retrieve a laptop bag at the murder scene, which would explain why his shoe had the victim's DNA on it and why fragments of his broken belt were found there. Nelson was convicted by the jury on October 8, 2012, of both capital murder and attempted capital murder. Following that, a sentencing hearing was held to determine whether Nelson should be given the death penalty or life in prison without parole. In its concluding arguments, the prosecution argued that Nelson should be executed because of his lengthy criminal history, which dates back to his early years. They also cited proof of Nelson's numerous instances of rule-breaking and violence in jail, including the murder of Jonathan Holden. They said that Nelson was a persistent threat to society because of his disregard for prison rules and rehabilitation initiatives, his numerous offenses prior to Dobson's murder, and his horrible actions of killing Dobson and attacking Elliot. However, the defense said that a life sentence was appropriate. In support of their client's life sentence, they cited Nelson's poor upbringing and learning disabilities, among other mitigating circumstances. Nelson had both antisocial personality disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, according to testimony from a forensic psychiatrist. Dobson's family and friends praised his excellent works as a preacher throughout his lifetime in their victim impact statements. Laura Dobson said her husband would be remembered for his humor and generosity. Philip Roseman, Dobson's father-in-law, also blasted Nelson for his crimes, saying he would never comprehend the horrible things Nelson did for a laptop and credit cards. All 12 jurors unanimously decided to impose the death penalty, and on October 16, 2012, Judge Mike Thomas condemned then 25-year-old Stephen Lewayne Nelson to death. In vengeance against the judge and jury for giving him a death sentence, Nelson reportedly broke a fire sprinkler and poured black fire retardant liquid into the courtroom following his sentencing. Nelson maintained his innocence even after his trial was over. He said that he struggled with anger management, but denied that he was a murderer. Following his death sentence, Nelson was moved to the Ellen B. Polunsky unit and spent the following 10 years behind bars. He appealed his death sentence during this time. All his appeals were denied. Judge Stephen Jones signed the execution order and death warrant for Nelson on June 10, 2024, after he had been on death row for nearly 12 years. The date of the sentence's execution is set for February 5, 2025. A group of opponents of the death penalty staged a protest rally on November 15, 2024, to voice their disapproval to Nelson's upcoming execution. Many Christians had different views about Nelson's upcoming execution. Some religious leaders, such as Jeff Hood, an opponent of the capital sentence, contended that the Bible showed that Nelson was not deserving of the death penalty and that his life should be spared. However, members of Clint Dobson's church, among others, were in favor of Nelson's execution. Nelson maintained his innocence in an interview conducted on February 3, 2025. While in prison, he got married to Helen Noah Dubois. Nelson stated that his wife will have to decide whether or not she wishes to witness his execution. If the death warrant remains standing, Nelson will be the first inmate in Texas to die by lethal injection in 2025. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.